I hear the noon whistle here in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, so this is my time to introduce myself and get things started today. This is Steve Larson with the Dairyman staff up here. We glad to have a big group of you with us out there today. We're looking forward to our presentation very much by Dr. Bill Weiss at The Ohio State University. We appreciate having you back with us, Bill. He's a repeat presenter. Glad to have you here. And we also want to express our appreciation to Kuhn for their support of and sponsorship of today's webinar. Always good to say hi and work with Dr. Mike Hutchins down at the University of Illinois, our co-host of the series. Jim Waltz is sidekick down there who helps us with technical things, and then Patty Hirchin up here on the Dairyman staff does some behind the scenes work too, and we appreciate that very much. With those comments, I'm going to call on our co-host, Dr. Mike Hutchins, to get things rolling by introducing Dr. Bill Weiss to you folks out there.
Well, Steve, thanks very much, and we certainly want to welcome all our listeners here, and certainly also want to appreciate Kuhn for sponsoring the webinar here today. It's my pleasure to introduce a personal and professional friend, Dr. Bill Weiss. Bill was on before, and we're excited to have him back again this week. He is professor of dairy cattle nutrition in the Department of Animal Sciences at The Ohio State University and is located at Worcester, which is the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center out there. Bill earned his BS, bachelor's and master's degree from Purdue University and his PhD from The Ohio State University, and was on the faculty since in 1989 with a joint research and extension appointment. His research areas include factors that affect digestive efficiency, minerals and vitamins in health, and variability in diets. He has co-authored 110 journal articles, 350 extension publications as far as that goes, and has lectured in over 35 different countries. And of course, his fame to claim now is he's vice chair of the 2016 Dairy NRC and also served on that committee back in 2001. So, Professor Weiss, we welcome you back to Hordes Dairyman, and the microphone is yours.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Steve. And thanks to Kuhn. And it's good to be back. Today, we're going to talk about feeding groups of cows. And we all, when we take nutrition class, when we formulate diets, we all pretty much start with a single cow, which isn't the real world anymore. We feed groups, and it's a different thing, and we have to think of things differently when we do groups. So what I want to talk about is we're going to talk when you're formulating a diet, what do you put in? When it asks you for body weights and milk yields, what do you put in for a group of cows? I'm going to spend some time on that. And then a lot is on what's called safety factors, and I'll define that more closely or more completely as we get into this. But you have to, as a nutritionist, you have to figure out how much over formulation you're going to accept. So I'm going to talk about factors that affect it. And I'm going to give you some suggestions or recommendations. And this is in red to remind me to tell you that there's virtually no research on proper formulation of groups. And this is it's tough research to do, but there's really almost no research saying if I feed for 10% more or 20% more, or if I feed controlled experiments, which is the optimum. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is is based on simulation data and statistics. And we think cows will behave the same, but we all know cows don't do computers as well as we'd like. So that's the objectives today. And so get this started. First question I have for the group is, from a nutritional point of view, what should be the first priority of grouping? Separating low producing and high producing cows, separating cows from Michigan from Ohio cows, separating 2-year-olds from older cows, or separating fresh cows, say the first few weeks, from cows in later lactation. Again, the first priority. I'll open it up.
Well, there's no all of the above, Mike, which is one of my favorite answers, but I'm going to go with the fresh cows today.
Yeah, I think, Steve, I'm going to go there too. The voting is interesting here. Obviously,
Oh, it is.
we don't have many Ohio State dairy farmers voting for separating from Michigan at this point, but we're off and running, and we're at almost 70%. So, Jim, let's last call for you Republicans. Let's go. Last call, and we're going to close. We're going to close.
We're going to need a tiebreaker here, I think.
And
whoa.
Okay. Well, the separating Michigan from Ohio cows is just done to protect the Michigan cows from getting beaten up. So that's not a nutrition separation. These other ones, we're going to go into more detail, but I'm kind of surprised of all the people who said first calf from older cows. That, to me, is a very, very high priority separation. And that's usually one of the first or the first separation I recommend. But that's really not for nutrition. It's good for a lot of things. It does wonderful things for those heifers, but you could even feed the same diet, and it's for other reasons. Fresh cows and high and production levels. Those are the reasons, and I'm going to go into those quite a bit more. So we'll get into that. All right, there's lots of reasons to separate cows, and there is no one right way. It's farm specific. You have to consider lots of factors. And I'm not going to, this is not a grouping webinar. It's if once you've made that decision. So I'm not going to go into all these different reasons, but however you decide to group cows, it will have an effect on formulation, because how you group affects the average milk yield of that group. And more importantly is the distribution of milk yields. In other words, how variable are they? What's the range? It also affects intake. You don't just have one intake. We have a pen average intake, but you're going to have cows eating very, very different intakes. And again, if you separate by production level or by reproduction status, the distributions of milk yields in those two pens may be very, very different. And again, once based on the average and the distribution of yields, intake, and other things, that decides what you should formulate for. So again, you have to decide how to separate cows, but once you do, you have to start thinking, how does that separation affect average production for the pen and the milk yield of the pen, or the distribution of the pens. Okay, so here's a cow. It has these are arbitrary units. Put whatever nutrient you want there, but it has a certain requirement for energy, for protein, for manganese, doesn't matter. But a pen looks like this. It has you're going to have cows with very low requirements, cows with very high requirements, and you could have even a wider range or a narrower range, again, depending on how you group cows. It might also be a non-normal distribution where if you have a bunch of late lactation cows you couldn't get bred, you might have a lot of cows with low requirements, so it might be a skewed distribution. One assumption I'm making for this whole entire webinar is a normal distribution, so that I am assuming you have some type of bell-shaped curve. I don't know if it's a wide bell-shaped or a narrow bell-shaped, but I'm assuming it's approximately bell-shaped. So this is requirements. But you have the exact same distribution for intakes, and we have to remember that. You have a pen average intake, but you've got cows eating 40 pounds. If the pen average was 52, 53, you might have cows eating 40 pounds, and you might have cows eating 60 pounds. And that has to be considered in formulation. Okay, so I want to start off with inputs. This is just an example NRC screen. I use this because I don't have to pay for copyright, so I can use the image. And when you're deciding, sitting at your computer, it asks for a lot of some inputs, cow inputs. But in reality, the ones that affect requirements, body weight, or affects formulation, body weight, days in milk, milk yield, and milk fat and protein. Everything else might have an effect, but it's pretty minor. So these are what I'm going to concentrate on. And so the question is, for a pen of cows, not for a cow, but for a pen of cows, what numbers do you put in here? So what I did was I asked the question, what matters? If you're going to be wrong, how much does it matter? So using NRC requirements, what I said is, okay, if I have very different body weights, I've got a cow at 900 pounds, so a Jersey versus a 1,500-pound Holstein at equal milk yield. And in this example, I'm saying both groups are producing 75 pounds of milk. The only thing that changes was a big change in body weight. And I said, how does that affect energy requirement? How does it affect protein requirement? You can see it has virtually no effect on metabolizable protein, and it only affects energy requirement by 11%. So a wide difference, or a large difference in body weight, has very small effect on requirements. So you can kind of guess here, take an average. Now over here, I have average body weight. So this is 1,200 pounds, the average of these two. But now I have a 50-pound cow and a 100-pound cow. And I said, what's the requirements? Protein is 55% higher in the 100-pound cow than the 50-pound cow. Energy requirements 64%. So this one matters. You have to think a lot about which milk yield you put in. Body weights, it's not that sensitive. Milk composition, and I just want to mention in the handouts, if you print those off, these might be wrong. These are correct. The ones in the handout, I think I only accounted for a change in lactation requirement. I ignored maintenance. So I have, again, a 75-pound cow producing pretty weak milk, 3.3 fat and 2.7 protein, versus some pretty rich milk here at 4.5 fat and 3.3. And I asked the same question, how does this affect energy requirement? How does it affect protein requirement? And it's about a 15% change. So again, not a big difference in milk composition, not a huge effect on requirements. On growth, parity, which is just another way to say growth. And again, I said, okay, what's the difference between you wanting a cow to grow a lactating cow now, not a spring and heifer or growing heifer, but a lactating cow. Let's say I want it to grow 1.6 pounds a day, which is high, versus no growth, say a mature cow. That adds up for this average cow to about a 10% increase in energy and protein. So again, it's not that big a deal. So if we look at everything here, well, let me back up. I'll get to that in a minute. But then we also have to look at how does all these things affect intake? And body weight, a big cow eats more. A big cow has higher requirements. So a lot of that actually cancels out. A high producing cow, most of the time, and this is a big most, or the times it's not is a big deal, but generally cows that produce more milk eat more. So again, that helps us in formulation. Milk components, and what I really should be saying here is milk component yield. That's what we need to talk about. But again, cows that have higher milk component yields, everything else being equal, generally eat more. So these things, part of the changes in requirements caused by these are compensated by changes in intake most of the time. The big problem here is days in milk, fresh cows. Days in milk has essentially no effect on requirement. Independent effect, you could say, well, maybe, some of the minerals are mobilized a little bit and so on, but generally days in milk is not a requirement factor, but it's a huge effect on intake. And this early lactation cow, what happens is we lose the relationship between this milk yield and the requirements for milk yield and intake. So this is why these fresh cows have to be separated. There's other reasons, but nutritionally it's because of this effect on intake. This is just from an experiment we did a while ago. I picked a cow that had the same milk production at two different points in her lactation. That's the only reason I picked this particular cow. I can't even remember the experiment. But at 2 points in her lactation, she was producing about 95 pounds of milk. These arrows have moved a little bit, but same milk production. But at early lactation, when she was producing 95 pounds, she was only eating 46 pounds of dry matter. Out here at 110 days, when she was producing 95 pounds, she was eating 55 pounds. So this disconnection between intake and milk yield caused by early lactation is why separating fresh cows have nutritional benefits. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. And so you need to think about here, I have a 20% difference in intake, same milk yield. So that means I'm going to have to formulate diets. This cow here at this intake will eat 700 grams less protein than this cow for a typical diet, and 6 megacals of energy if she's in the same pen. So this, again, this disconnect is why separating by days in milk is so important nutritionally. And again, I'm going to cover that a lot. So now to wrap up here this first part, body weight, milk composition, and parity. These are not major drivers of milk production. If you go out and say, oh, my cows in this pen probably weigh 1,400 pounds, and you're off, and you've got cows 200 or 300 pounds lighter and 200 or 300 pounds heavier, it really doesn't make a big deal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time calculating average body weights and distributions. I'm going to use my best guess at pen average, or in some cases, the herd average. Milk composition, to me, most of the time, if you use bulk tank, if you don't have pen average milk composition, the bulk tank is close enough. Parity, if you do separate by parity, if you have parity 1, use parity 1, but if they're all in one big group, I use parity 2. It's just not that big a deal. Milk yield and days in milk can have a huge effect on formulation. These are the ones we need to think about. And again, that's what we're going to cover. Okay, here's an example herd. This is a commercial herd from Ohio here. This is where they have individual milk weights. And the histogram is in yield in kilograms, but I converted here. They have cows producing less than 4 or 5 cows. 3 or 4 cows in this pen were producing less than 35. There's 110 cows here. And 3 or 4 cows were producing 130 pounds. And you can see it's approximately a bell-shaped curve. For this particular pen, average was 75 pounds. The standard deviation was 13. So this is going to be kind of my example herd, or example pen, sorry. So the question is, what do you expect from this pen? Well, rule 1 is you can formulate for the average, which is right around here, 75 pounds, and you will have cows producing substantially more than average, because high-producing cows eat more than low-producing cows. So if I have a pen, and this is important, and I hope I keep remembering to say it, in this pen, if this particular pen did not include fresh cows, and I say past peak intake, really it's past 3 or 4 weeks in milk. So it's not at peak yet, but it's getting close. So if I don't have these very fresh cows in there, if I formulate for the mean, I usually can produce, or these cows can usually produce about 20% more than the mean, because they eat more. So in this example, the herd average was 75 pounds, but I do expect cows in there at 90 pounds or so. They're going to produce more. The problem, if you formulate at the mean, is these cows, these high producing cows. They're going to eat more, but they can't eat enough more. But again, remember, you will get more than the average because high producing cows eat more. So just a general rule is the herd average, if you balance for the pen average, again, in this example, it's 75 pounds, take the pen average multiply it by either 1.15 or 1.2, and that's telling you this is about the maximum milk I'm going to expect from that pen. If this is the maximum production in that pen, you're fine. If not, you need to balance for more than the mean. Okay, So one of the first questions when I'm formulating is, does this pen have fresh cows? And again, my definition of a fresh cow for this seminar is 3 or 4 weeks. So if you say, I asked this question, does the pen have include fresh cows? If it is just fresh cows, so you've got a fresh cow pen up to 3 or 4 weeks, my formulation goal is feed intake. Feed intake, feed intake. Everything I do in that pen is I'm asking myself, is this going to have a negative effect on intake? And if it does, I'm not going to do it. So I put much more emphasis on feed intake here than meeting requirements. Because if I can get a cow to eat and increase intake quickly, I usually can get the milk. And I'll talk a little more about this, but again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of formulating for high intakes in a fresh group. So if you have a pen of just later lactation cows, so the fresh cows are in their own pen and you've got another pen of everything else. This we're going to spend time on. This is easy, and it's also efficient, nutritionally efficient. If you have a pen with all the cows, fresh and later lactation, this becomes difficult. It becomes nutritionally inefficient, and it can become expensive because the effect of early lactation nutrition on these cows has effects on peaks. You have to give these fresh cows a lot of weight. Even though they make up a small proportion of the cows, when you're balancing a diet, you have to give those cows a lot of weight, because if they're not fed right, you're going to lose production the entire lactation. And again, I'm going to spend time on that. Okay, so now we get into the safety factor. My definition of a safety factor, and different people have different definitions, so this is the one I'm going to use. It's the degree of overfeeding relative to pen average requirements. So if the average cow, example here, if the average pen average production was 80 pounds, I might have, this is purely for example, I'm going to get into how I get these numbers, but I might say I want a 10% safety factor, so I want to be able to support 88 pounds. So this is the safety factor. It's the degree of overfeeding that I'm going to formulate based on pen average. So that's my definition. And everything I'm going to give is not pounds. It's going to be this times factor. So it's average pen average production times some factor that will always be greater than 1, or 1 or greater, I should say. Okay, time for a little audience participation. So relative to safety factors, my question is, when you're formulating diets with a safety factor, would you have the same relative safety factor for everything? Whatever it is, I'm using 15%, but that's just an example, but everything has the same. Or protein has the greatest safety factor, energy has the greatest safety factors, or my favorite, minerals and vitamins, have the greatest safety factor.
Well, we're off and running here. The polls are open. What do you think, Steve?
Well, I don't know. I went first last time. How about you?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to take a buy. I'm going to go for protein, but I have a reason for that, but I don't want to bias the vote. Far be it from me, being a Republican or Democrat, to bias the vote here. Steve, where are you going to go?
Well, being an independent, let me choose energy. I have a weird reason for doing that, but that's what I'm going to suggest.
Okay.
My vote this time. I know that vitamins and minerals are Bill's wheelhouse compounds there, but so let's just see. I don't know how
that word "all" really kind of says that turns that one off pretty quick. All or kind of never, Anyway, we're at 70%. So Jim, let's close this poll off.
Well, let's see what
Professor Weiss, what do you think of the answers you got here?
Oops, sorry. Well, I'm not going to tell you the right answer quite yet. We will get to there. But I do want to say this is not right. And this can cause a lot of problems. In the past, this is pretty much what we had to do, but our models are better now, but you treat nutrients independently. The rest here I'm going to go into in quite a detail. I am going to just say that, with more than half at energy, I think those people will be surprised as to what I say. Whether I'm right or not, I'll let them decide.
I think you just lost Steve, but we'll move on.
Okay.
It sounds that way.
The thing when you're sitting down thinking about what nutrients have safety factors, these are the things you need to think about. How quickly will a cow respond to a deficiency? So if I don't feed enough, will they respond? And basically we're talking production. We're not going to talk so that they're fed so poorly it's a health issue. So think if a cow's deficient in manganese, she can be deficient for months and months, and I'll never know. If a cow is deficient in protein, she might respond pretty quickly and lost milk. On the other hand, we are formulating diets that are excess for the average cow. And you need to think, what's that going to do long term, this oversupply of a nutrient long term in weeks or months? What's it going to do to this cow? Think energy. If you feed a cow excess energy for months and months, you might end up with a bunch of fat cows, which is something we don't want. You also have to think on the models. I'm not going to go into individual models, but how good do you think your model is at predicting requirement for nutrient X? And for example, I think, in my opinion, the 2001 NRC overestimates protein requirements. And so if I'm formulating with that model, I tend to make a lower safety factor for protein because I think there's already built in a little bit of a cushion. You might have other model you use, you might say, well, this is not enough protein, but you have to make that decision. And then the last thing you have to ask is milk the driver of this requirement, because that's how we're establishing safety factors. And again, for minerals, milk is not a major factor. Other things are. So you'll see in just a second, this because minerals really, they're important for milk, but not that important, or you can be off quite a bit in minerals and still get milk. They have a different safety factor. So this idea that everything is the same, I'm going to feed 20% extra, everything, that's not what we want to do anymore. So rule 1, never, ever, ever feed to the average cow. In other words, you should always have a safety factor. You should always overfeed the average cow in a group. Why is this? Well, it's the simple response function. When this is protein, this is very theoretical, or nothing ever looks this nice. But what this is saying is, as I provide more of a nutrient, I get a response up to a point where something else limits production. It might be energy, it might be genetics, it might be heat stress, but something. So I can feed more and more and more protein and get absolutely nothing. But when I'm below this point, feeding more, I get a response. And to put this a little simpler, here's again just a theoretical example. And in this example, I'm going to say all cows are eating the same. Again, I'm just doing this as an example. So intakes are all the same. So if I formulate a diet that perfectly feeds this average cow, I'm going to have cows that are producing less than average and cows producing more. In the 50% of the cows that are below average, in other words, these 50% of these cows are overfed for nutrient X. But I expect no response. In other words, this cow down here with low milk production, because she's fed for this production, doesn't mean she's going to respond. Something else is limiting her production. So I get no increase in production for these 50%, even though they're overfed. On the other hand, in these 50% of cows that are underfed, our nutrient models say eventually, depending on the nutrient, you will lose milk. So when you feed the average, you don't get a benefit from all the below average cows, but you see a negative for all the above cows. So that's why we never feed to the average. You always feed more. The question is, how much more? Okay, I want to get rid of minerals and vitamins first. This safety factor is independent of production. In other words, I don't care what the distribution of milk yields are in pens, I'm going to have the same safety factor. Minerals and vitamins are, I put safety factors in looking at the uncertainty, how confident am I in the delivery of these nutrients, on absorption, so on. Is there antagonisms, high sulfur water, I'm going to feed more copper, so on. Generally, and this is a whole nother seminar, so I'm going to just have to go quick here on this, but usually I'm about 20% extra. If I have a lot of antagonism, I might be 50%. But this is, again, it doesn't matter how I group cows. This is just kind of a standard recommendation. So we're done with minerals and vitamins. Rumen degradable protein. This is extremely important nutrient. It's one of the ones I look at first in the diet because it helps drive the rumen. And we all know we have to optimize rumen production. It's inexpensive, which would tell me, okay, I can be a little bit excess. There's data I'll just show you that says if you feed enough, intake is good. On the downside is we know it increases, if you overfeed it, increase urinary nitrogen loss. This is an environmental issue. So there's always balances in everything. The other thing to remember is that RDP, rumen degradable protein, is not required by the cow per se. It's required by bugs, rumen bacteria. Rumen bacteria do not produce milk. So we're not feeding for milk here. We're feeding to get these bacteria to multiply and grow. Their growth is essentially a function of how much energy these cows eat. So milk production, again, really doesn't come into this requirement. You want to feed enough extra, but it's for intake, or intake determines the requirement. This is a study, it's a little old now, but it just shows using the NRC system. Other models will give you different numbers, but showing the NRC system, high intakes or high concentrations of RDP stimulates feed intake. And again, I'm willing to overfeed RDP. I'm willing to spend a little more money because of this potential benefit. But again, it's independent of milk. So pretty much this is a nutrient that I just feed on a percent basis. I don't worry about grams or whatever. And somewhere using the NRC system, I'm going to be greater than requirements, but 10.5%. Independent for a low producing cow, it's going to be 10 to 10.5% for a 150-pound cow. It's going to be 10 or 10.5% of the dry matter. That'll be milk yield doesn't come into play. Overfeed, but independent of milk yield. The one we really look at here, we call it metabolizable protein, but again, since RDP is fixed from the previous slide, what we're really looking at is how much digestible RUP, and really as we get smarter and smarter, this is going to be more and more amino acid based. Right now I'm sticking with just MP, but we're moving to amino acids. What the question we're really talking about with protein safety factors is MP, which again is really digestible RUP. Inadequate MP reduces milk yield. There's limited body stores. If cows aren't fed enough MP of the right amino acids, milk yield drops. That tells me feed more. However, this is an extremely expensive nutrient. Degraded digestible RUP is expensive. That's high feed cost. It also means if I overfeed, I get more nitrogen in the manure, environmental issues. This is telling me I'll feed less. And so you've got to balance these two. And it's not a constant. Conditions will say, okay, I can do more or less, but always over. Okay, so the question is how much over? Well, we have all these cows are fed adequately if I feed for the average cow. And this fits a normal curve, a normal distribution. Basically, one additional standard deviation unit will feed essentially all the cows in that pen. And I'll spend a little more time on this, but in this example, the average was 75 pounds. The standard deviation was 13. And again, this pen has individual milk weight, so I know this. So basically what this is saying is if my MP allowable milk for that pen was 88 pounds, that's 75 plus 13, 1 standard deviation, I should be feeding every cow in that pen adequately. I'm feeding a whole lot of cows excess, but 1 standard deviation above the mean says I'm feeding all the cows adequately. So what do? You use one thing people tend to do, or when they're not thinking right, is they'll put in 88 pounds into their computer, let the computer generate intake. That's not what you do. You have to generate, either use a measured pen average intake, or use to estimate intake, use the actual milk production. In this example, 75. But don't let the computer estimate intake with these high milk yields. My maximum MP allowable milk, and maximum is what I mean, it isn't the average, I will be here or less, is the mean plus 1 standard deviation. And a lot of you are probably saying, well, this is great and wonderful for a university professor, but I don't know the standard deviation. I can't measure this on my farms because I don't have individual milk weights. Right now, based on very limited data, and hopefully there'll be better data, on average from limited data, the standard deviation in pens we've looked at was 16% of the mean. So I'm going to use that. If I don't know the measured standard deviation, I'm going to estimate SD as 0.16 times the mean. And again, if you have a better number, use it. So for this example, they're eating 58 pounds. They're milking 90. I don't know the standard deviation because I don't have individual milk weights. I'm assuming a coefficient of variation, which is standard deviation divided by mean, is 16. So basically, my maximum MP allowable milk is the mean times 1.16, 104. So I'm going to formulate that diet so that with this intake, I have an MP allowable milk of 104 pounds. If I'm using NRC, because again, in my opinion, it overestimates requirements, I'm going to probably be less than that, a little bit. Now, as to energy, because you have to remember, in theory, NEL allowable milk should equal, if our system was perfect, NEL allowable milk should equal the milk production of the pen. Because what that means is cows that are producing more than that will lose a little weight, lose a little condition, but then as they become below average cows, as the lactation progresses, they'll gain it back. So this ability of the cow to change body energy reserve should mean should be balancing for the target, the actual amount. But there's a lot of error. There's a lot of error in these estimates. We're estimating feed concentrations of energy requirements. These are a little bit nebulous. But I'm not going to overfeed too much. I'm saying I might start at 10% extra. So my NEL allowable milk might be 1.1 times average. I may change it. It may go up or it may go down, and I'm monitoring body condition. If I'm starting to get a lot of fat cows in that pen, this thing might turn into a 1. If I'm getting thin cows, this 1.1 might turn into a 1.2. But don't go overboard because of the long-term effects of excess energy. So again, protein tends to have a higher safety factor than energy. That gets us to these fresh cows. And this complicates it because, again, we don't have the connection between intake and production. So with this diverse pen, now I'm saying you do not separate the fresh cows, you throw them into one pen. So now the question is, what should the safety factor be? I need to back up here. I forgot something. This is without fresh cows. Up to this point, I've said you've got a group of cows that all the fresh cows are elsewhere. So up to this point, no fresh cows. But now you're going to say, well, I can't separate. I've got to put my fresh cows in with my high cows. What should this safety factor be? Well, there's some things that have to go into this. One is how many fresh cows you got. If you have just one in a pen of 100, you might not be able to do much. If you got 10 or 15 in a pen of 100, you have to take this into consideration. I always bias toward the fresh cow. In other words, I'm going to give them more weight. They may make only 10% of that pen, but I'm going to give them some more weight because of this long-term effects. You can't forget that if you shortchange these cows, the peak might suffer and you'll pay for that for 300 days. This part of this is now largely theoretical simulation. So this one is, I feel less confident in this, but this is what we have right now. So with this pen with fresh cows and other cows, so it's what I call diverse pens, I'm assuming about 10% fresh cows in this pen. And that's how we simulated this. And what we came up with is for this pen, MP allowable milk maximum should be actually not the mean plus 1 standard deviation, but actually the mean plus 1.5 standard deviations. So again, if you don't know standard deviation and you use my 16, 1.5 times that is 24. So now this safety factor for these diverse pens isn't 1.16, it's 1.24. So by combining or putting fresh cows into this pen, I'm having to overfeed protein more. There's a cost to that. But I'm arguing that that cost is worth it and I won't lose peaks. Again, I'm not going to die for this number. I'm not that confident in, but I am certain it will be higher than for a pen without fresh cows. So how much is separating fresh cows worth strictly on feed cost? There's lots of reasons to separate fresh cows, and there's a lot of good reasons too. But I'm going to stick to just nutrition, just cost. So if I have this diverse group, I'm going to have to overfeed protein. My MP allowable milk will be the mean times 1.24. If I have separate groups for fresh cows and my high group, so no other separations, just fresh and high, my fresh cows, I'm going to overfeed by 30%. And again, this is based on some simulation. We're actually doing some experiments right now to hopefully maybe answer this a little bit better, but I don't have that data yet. So this is overfed. These fresh cows up to 3 or 4 weeks, 30% excess because the intake is so low compared to requirements. My high group, I told you earlier, if I don't know the standard deviation, I'm going to use 16. So my high group is going to be fed at 1.16 times, or the MP allowable milk is going to be 16% greater than the mean. And if you take a weighted average here, 10% of the herd is going to be this overfed, 90% of the herd will be this degree of overfeeding. That means for the whole herd, I'm overfeeding by 17% protein. Or my maximum MP allowable milk is going to be 17% higher than the average. If I don't separate these cows, I'm 24% above average. So this separation means I feed less protein, less cost, less environmental issues. And again, I'm not convinced these are absolutely correct, but the concept is correct. So for one last question here. What should, now in addition to what we've already talked about, but what should affect safety factors used for group formulations? One is the distribution of milk yields within a pen, feed and milk prices, ingredient consistency, and what I call feed management consistency.
Wow. Stephen, I'll let you vote first. It's your turn to go first. I tell you, this looks pretty scary.
Well, I'm kind of still looking for all of the above or none of the above, but I don't see them there. So, well, my goodness.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to swag this thing. Everybody knows what swag stands for. I'm going to go for distribution of milk yields within group. But
yeah, I'm leaning there too, Mike. But well, and you know, we're voting with the majority there. Just not to put too fine of a point on it, but we've been fooled on these polls before today.
Now, where did this we stuff come in and come us out?
Well, anyway, how are we doing on voting?
Well, I tell you, we're at
63%.
Yeah, we're almost there, and then our time is going to get away from us. We better close this off. And do Democrats just sit there? And here we go, Bill.
Okay, well, this is a question. That's why my students hate me. The answer is all of the above or any of these. They all have to be considered, but I didn't want to put all of the above. It's too easy. So any of the answer is correct, and I'll go a little more into this. This is milk distribution within a pen clearly will affect safety factor. And here's an example. Again, if I don't know, I'm going to use this 16%. But if you automatically start saying, okay, I'm going to have cows up to 80 pounds are going to be in this pen, 80 to 120 is this pen, so on. You reduce variation. There's absolutely no question of that. So if you have this distribution, your safety factor will still be one standard deviation, but that standard deviation is going to be a lot smaller than if you have this one. So again, just in case you want to know how to calculate this, you have, if you're going to do this to take advantage of this, you have to have some idea of the distribution of milk yields, a standard deviation from DHI data, from individual milk weights or something. But you take the standard deviation calculated some way for each pen, divided by the average for that pen, add it to 1. So in this example, again, 16 is my default, but in this example, I say I'm sorting cows, so my standard deviation is actually pretty small. I have a pen average of 80, standard deviation is 7, so 7 divided by 80 plus 1. For this pen or this group, my safety factor is only 109. For the average here with the unknown is 1.16. And it could be bigger too if you really have diversity. So the one standard deviation is constant, but the size of that standard deviation is not. And here again, I'm not going to go on into this at all, but bigger standard deviations mean you overfeed more because you've got more of these really, really high producing cows. Feed cost to milk price. You can't ignore this. If I have cheap feed and expensive milk, I'm going to risk, in fact, I'm not going to risk being deficient in anything. I don't want nutrition to limit production because the cost of feed is cheap relative to milk. I want to maximize milk, so I'm going to over-formulate a lot. A few years ago, we had very expensive feed. Then I'm over-formulating, but I'm over-formulating less. So those numbers I've given you, remember, they're maximum. You can go less depending on things. Feed quality control, consistency. If I'm sure, absolutely sure, I have high confidence that I've formulated a diet, and I know I'm not supposed to use crude protein, but I'm still old. So if I formulated a diet for 16% and I have high confidence that they're going to deliver a 16% protein diet every day or most days, I need a smaller safety factor. So just think, if your uncertainty increases risk, the risk we're talking about is deficiencies, lost milk, uncertainty, more uncertainty, I overfeed more. And the uncertainty extends to feed ingredients. Again, if you don't know, you're buying a bunch of undescribed byproducts and you're assuming a lot of this protein is coming from them. If you're on this red guy here, where you say, well, the average protein in this diet or average MP in this diet might be 10%, but it's going to be plus or minus a huge amount, I'm going to overformulate. So if you've got uncertainty in ingredients like this red farm or red diet, compared to this green farm or green diet, which is much more consistent, uncertainty increases risk, I'm going to overformulate more. And this is just a made up example. This consistent diet with consistent ingredients, I might have 10% metabolizable protein. For this inconsistent diet with inconsistent ingredients, I might formulate for 12. And what I've done is equalized my deficiency risk, but I'm wasting an awful lot of money. So I'd say the thing to do is make this farm more consistent. Inconsistencies increase risk, increase the safety factor. So to wrap up today's webinar, first of all, formulate for above average milk for a pen. Unquestionable. The question is, what degree? This protein safety factor to me is the most critical because short-term deficiencies cost milk, long-term overfeeding has an economic cost, but it really doesn't affect the cow too much. So I'm going to typically I'm most concerned about feeding extra protein. And again, this average safety factor, if you don't have anything else right now for a group of cows without fresh cows in it, is about 1.16. If you get out the fresh cows up to 3 or 4 weeks, this increases efficiency, nutritional efficiency. You overfeed less for the whole pen, for the whole herd. You do also increase nutritional efficiency by grouping by production. And I can't tell you which one has the bigger bang for the buck, because I don't know how. If you can make a bunch of pens that are very, very consistent, that should probably have more bang than the buck than this one. But if you can't have 10 pens, this one has a tremendous benefit. But both are very good. And then lastly, things you do to increase consistency should reduce the overfeeding necessary. So think of things you can do on client farms or your farms to make things more consistent. And then instead of maybe 16% overfeeding, you might be able to go to 14, 12, something, because you're much more confident that the diet you formulate is the diet these cows are actually going to get. And again, I want to just remind you that 16% is when you don't know the standard deviation for a pen. If you do, use your own data. Don't use 16. And with that, that concludes the seminar. I had to end up with a picture of Brutus. And I think, Steve, do you want to take over now, or?
Yes,
Okay.
I will. Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much for a great job. Very interesting. Always nice to have a fresh, insightful look at some of the old questions that we face in feeding our cows. And you've done a great job with that. And we also appreciate Kuhn's support of your webinar today. Just want to remind our listeners that they will be receiving a survey here in the next few days. We really do appreciate your response on those. It just takes a few seconds to do that, and it's helpful to us. This webinar in a few days, and all of our previous webinars are available for you and your colleagues and cohorts on our archives, horge.com, the webinar section there. And now looking ahead, our May webinar, as you can see there, will be by Paul Fricke, another returning webinar presenter for us. Strategies for non-pregnancy diagnosis in cows. Parnell will be the sponsor. And looking a little bit further ahead, June 13, Jack Rodenberg, many of you know him from Ontario, we'll be talking about barn designs for robotic milking. Again, now let me ask Mike, have you been kind of reviewing any questions that maybe we should be looking at to finish up the webinar?
You betcha.
What are you seeing there? Okay, this is what you refer to as the speed round, right?
This is the speed round, and Dr. Weiss, you better be speedy. That's all I got to say, because there are quite a few here. You're not going to get off easy. The first question comes in early, and he says, how much, according to you, is the NRC 2001 overestimating metabolizable protein? He just is going to accept, I guess, a little, Bill. Do you have a number for him?
I think it's at least 10% from diets. And these are Midwest diets, corn silage, alfalfa, corn grain, soybean meal. So I think it's about 10% over. So for NRCs, I'm going to be closer to about 10%. If using that 16% over safety factor, it's usually closer to 10% for me. Again, for Midwest diets.
Bill,
my experience.
Just let me interject here, Bill. Speaking of NRC, you might want to make a brief comment. We are running short of time about NRC 2017 or whatever the label will be.
Well, we're hoping to have it out next year. That's still the plan. We're on schedule. So mid 2017, we hope to have it out.
Okay.
Don't hold me to that, but that's the hope.
Okay, back to you, Mike.
Very good. Bill, the impact, we see farmers have fresh cow pens for 10 days, 21 days, 45 days, and obviously dry matters are really different on those. Any comments on the time of the cow stay in the fresh pen versus what you were talking about today?
I think the 45 days to me is too long. You're going to have cows that are approaching peak intakes and cows that are very, very low intakes. So 45, there's some benefits to separating fresh cows, but again, that to me is too long. I like, for nutritional reasons, 3 or 4 weeks. These shorter times, again, you're getting some benefits. These cows getting on their feet, small pens, you can look at them. So if it was 10 days, may not make that big of nutritional adjustments. I'm still going to have a little bit over my safety factor for the high pen will be a little bit elevated. But again, there's other reasons to separate. But to me, the clear one I get most concerned with is too long. You've essentially turned the fresh cow group into a high group. So don't let them in there too long.
Very good. Are there any differences in safety factors for Jerseys versus Holsteins, the breed impact? Any thoughts on that one?
I would say no, and that's based on my opinion only. I have no data to support that, but I don't see why it would be. The connections between intake, production's all the same. Everything's the same. So I would just for lack of any other reason, I'd say, yeah, I think I'd use the same numbers.
Here's another thorny one on smaller farms where the number of fresh cow limits the possibility of grouping an all fresh cow group. How would you decide if you would create an early lactation group up to 100 days versus saying a low group and then a low group of production cows?
Yeah, that's a really important question. In these smaller farms, grouping becomes an issue. And in this case, I'd really say, okay, I can't afford to have a pen with 3 cows in it. I can't feed them correctly. I can't manage them correctly. And in that case, I'm not going to have a fresh group. So you sit and think, where can I put these fresh cows? And you want to put them in an uncrowded pen. That's to me a high priority. The diet, I'm going to overfeed protein. I don't, the nutritional thing isn't that big or my highest priority. I'm going to put them in a less crowded, very well designed pen, my best pen, all this kind of stuff. And just feed them again as a diverse group. So I'm going to overfeed that group. But I would not, if you've got cows up to 100 days or all, it's not a fresh group. It's two production groups, both fed at 24% overfeeding. I might, again, thinking of these fresh cows, I might put them in the 2-year-old group, but really I'm going to put them in the least crowded group, and the diet is secondary.
Very good. I think this one comes from Spain. Do we need to put RUP in diets? Dr. Balch believes that with current high rates of passage and high yielding cows, most of the protein is going to be RUP. So we're just not going to feed any RUP sources. Any comments?
Well, we know as cows eat more, they do RUP increases, but there's still an awful lot of data out there with high producing cows showing, increased milk protein yields with high quality RUP supplements. So depending on your production level, you don't need supplemental RUP in every diet, but just to rely on high intakes, I don't think I'd do that. There's just too much data out there on milk protein yields showing a response. We have to, we're using this very nebulous and vague term called RUP. It's amino acids, and we know that. So a lot of times you're not getting a response because the RUP to me is low quality, not the amino acids we need. But I still think for high producing cows, you can't rely on intake causing all this bypass.
Well, here comes the next question. I knew it was going to come. What about these pen moves? Wisconsin researchers at the vet school say, boy, we don't want to be moving these cows all the time as far as that goes, and the impact it can have on dry matter intake, moving, say, fresh cows into the high group, for example. What's your feeling on that?
That's another thing that you have to consider. And again, the data is just, we haven't done a great job as university faculty or university researchers on looking at these pen effects. It's always been individual cows. There's a concern. There is some data out there showing these move effects are not long term. You know, you move multiple cows, all this kind of stuff. Use good protocols. I still think, again, if you can handle it, I wouldn't move them 46 times. But to me, if a high group or a fresh group to a high group, that the benefits of keeping those cows separate, high observations, low density, all this thing outweigh what appears to be a transient effect of moving. So whether I move them later in lactation, that's another question. But I still think the move is less negative than the positives of having fresh cows separate if you can do it.
Some of our listeners are intrigued with your standard deviation. Should DHI or consultants be calculating that for farmers on the farm? And is there easy software available so a farmer, if he had milk weights, he could generate that if somebody else isn't going to do it for him?
Okay. I think it'd be a great idea for DHI to do that by pen. Again, not for the herd, but by the pen. If you have individual milk weights and you can feed that into Excel or some spreadsheet, every spreadsheet I know of has this SD function. I can't remember what it's called. I think for Excel it's STD, I think, or STDEV, but it's in there. So if you have the data, they're very easy to calculate. Any software will do it, calculators will do it. But again, if DHI could do it, if a consultant gets that data and he does it, feeds it into, the biggest work is just getting into a spreadsheet and pressing the button, you have it. I think this is going to become a critical number as we get to have to feed more precise diets, not only standard deviation on milk yield, but standard deviations on diet deliveries. I think it's going to become very, very important.
The people were very interested in your metabolizable protein approach. Does that mean, should we actually be looking at amino acids? Does that mean my fresh cows are almost always going to get rumen-protected amino acids in their diets?
I don't know the answer to that one. I'd say, again, I'm going to look very carefully at that. We have reasonable requirements or reasonable ideas on methionine and lysine. A little bit of data on histidine, but there's been surprisingly little data looking at just amino acids in these very fresh cows. Again, with fresh cows, what I want to do is get them to eat. And I don't know if amino acids do that or not at that stage in lactation. So I'm going to look at it. But again, my main emphasis on fresh cows is getting them to eat. So in the high group, I pay a lot of attention to amino acids now. The fresh cows, some, but not as much, because I don't know how sensitive they are to amino acids at that stage of production. So that's a non-answer, but that's the best I can do.
We're going to add one last question here. It came from, I think, one of our new listeners. And he said, and it's somewhat related, sir, in early peak lactation, cows need more energy, but dry matter is really limiting. But and fat, of course, is an excellent source of energy. But we can't add fat to the ration because the cow is mobilizing fat and therefore may affect dry matter intake. Any comments on that, Dr. Weiss, on your fresh cow pen?
That nailed it. That's the problem. That's why I'm not going to get too excited about energy on feeding extra, because very often you say, okay, I'm going to formulate a diet to get more energy per pound, feed fat. That turns around. If you look across all the studies, feeding fat typically reduces feed intake a little bit. It might increase energy intake a little, but not nearly as much as we think. Or you might say, I'm going to feed more grain. And all these things can have the effect of reducing feed intake. So yeah, that's why, again, overfeeding energy or formulating these high energy diets oftentimes don't work, because they just eat less, and you see, other than increases in feed cost, you don't see much because energy intake didn't change as much as you think it would. So I think he's right on what he said.
Well, Bill Weiss, thanks for all your great answers. And Steve, we'll turn it back to you to wind it up.
Yes. My thanks also, Bill, for a great presentation and a great job with the questions and answers. We have 80% of our original audience still with us, anxious to find out how you're going to respond to those questions. That's great. That shows a lot of interest. So thanks again to you, and also thanks to Kuhn for their sponsorship of this. And again, Paul Fricke coming up in May 9th. Looking ahead, June 13th, our webinar will be presented by Jack Rodenberg on designing barns for robotic milking. And so we hope to have many of you with us for those sessions as well. And with those comments, this is Steve Larson signing off from the Horge Dairyman office up here in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Thanks for being with us today.